Hello again. Micaela here with another silly song and another very old silly song. Today's silly song is kind of like an argument between two people, a man and his wife. The man's name is Henry and his wife's name is Liza. And it's really a dialogue. You could say it's an argument. And even though everything on the poster, everything that we sing is something that someone is saying, I still didn't use quotation marks because the whole thing is quotation marks. And that would be a lot of quotation marks. Now, I made this, it really goes back and forth like a good dialogue. One person talks than the other. And so I put everything that Henry says on this side, and his name's at the top in brown, and everything that Liza says is on this side. Henry speaks first, and then Liza, and then we go to the blue words, Henry, then Liza, and then the orange words, Henry, then Liza. Henry is supposed to do some chores. Liza has her own chores to do too. But Henry, he kind of sounds like he's not very smart. He might actually be really smart because he's coming up with clever ways of getting out of having to do his chores. He keeps coming to Liza with problems. I can't do my chores because of blah, blah, blah. And like many wives, she helps him find solutions to his problems so that he can do his chores. So let's learn the first verse, which is red, and we'll sing it, you then me, you then me. When it's your turn to sing, I'll sing quieter than you, but I'll sing with you. You see if you can sing louder than me. Also, when it's your turn to sing, the guitar will play. So let's get the guitar. So the guitar's all ready. We're going to do quite a lot of words, about half those red words. Me, then you. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. How'd you do? Now let's do Liza's answer. And we'll do about half of it and then the other half. She says, well then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, fix it. Well then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, fix it. So even though they're kind of having an argument, they're still pretty polite to each other. He calls her Dear Liza, and he says that a lot, and she calls him Dear Henry. Dear is like saying sweetie or honey, so they're still being nice to each other, even though by the end they're a little exasperated with each other. So let's sing all the red words, Henry and then Liza, together. Here we go. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Well then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well then fix it, dear Henry, fix it. And then he says, with what shall I fix it, dear Liza, dear? And she says, with a straw. That seems a little odd, but in the old days, they used to use straw. We're not talking about a straw that you sip your drink from. We're talking about wheat that's already been threshed, so there's no more wheat on it. And people actually used to use this for the roofs of their houses because it was kind of like plastic. The water would just run right off it and not go through. And so somehow the bucket and the hole in the bucket's going to get fixed with pieces of straw. So let's do the blue words, and then we're going to do something strange with the song. Here we go. Henry first. With what shall I fix it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fix it, dear Liza? With what? With a straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a straw, dear Henry, a straw. And then he says, well, if the straw is too long, we're on the orange words. what am I going to do? And of course she says, well, then cut it. There's going to be times on Liza's part where she's got to be thinking, well, duh. And he says, with what shall I cut it? And she says, with a knife. And he says, but the knife is too dull. And here's an interesting word. She says, well, then whet it. That's not the word wet. That's actually coming later. This word has an H in it. The word whet means to sharpen. So she says to sharpen it, but she uses the word whet. And then he says, with what shall I whet it? And she says, with a stone. And in the old days, people really did used to sharpen their knives and their scissors on stones, on a rock. And he says, but the stone is too dry. It does help if the rock is wet. And she says, well, then wet it. Duh. And here's an even more duh. Green words. With what shall I wet it? Well, not with Kool-Aid, with water. And then he says, well, how should I fetch the water? That means how shall I get the water over to the stone? And she says, in a bucket. And you know it's coming. At the end of the song, he says, but there's a hole in the bucket. And we're back to where we started from. Now, the goofy thing I'm going to do with you is I'm going to sing Henry's part like a man. That means I'm going to sing it an octave lower. An octave is 8 notes. If you know your hand signs, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. The 2 do's are 8 notes apart. If you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, it's hard for kids to sing low, so you probably don't want to try to sing low with me. You can still sing, there's a hole in the bucket, but when I'm singing Henry, I'm going to sing down here, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Henry. And since he's on that side, I'm going to look a little bit this way when Henry's talking to Liza, and I'll look this way when Liza is talking to Henry. And you can do that too if you want to. Let's do the whole song. Ready? There's a hole in the bucket, dear Eliza, dear Eliza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Eliza, a hole. Well, then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, then fix it, dear Henry, fix it. With what shall I fix it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fix it, dear Liza? With what? With a straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a straw, dear Henry, a straw. If the straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. If the straw is too long, dear Liza, too long. Well, then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, then cut it, dear Henry, cut it. With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what? With a knife, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a knife, dear Henry, a knife. If the knife is too dull, dear Liza, dear Liza. If the knife is too dull, dear Liza, too dull. Well, then whet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, then whet it, dear Henry, whet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a stone, dear Henry, a stone. If the stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. If the stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry. Well, then wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, then wet it, dear Henry, wet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water. With what shall I fetch it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fetch it, dear Liza? With what? With a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry. A bucket. But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza. A hole. Oh, men. That's probably what Liza would say. I hope you had fun. I know I had fun. Bye.